So we are going to continue our discussion on campaign finance with two representatives of two of the top organizations that gather data from states and the federal government, from the FEC, that help reporters do their job. I'm sure you're all familiar with opensecrets.org, their website, the website for the Center for Responsive Politics, and followthemoney.org, the website for the National Institute on Money and Politics. And so we have people from those two organizations here to come talk about big picture trends they're seeing, as well as some of the new tools that they have beyond just the straight contributions information that I'm sure you're all familiar with. We have with us Sheila Krumholz, who is Executive Director of the Center for Responsive Politics. And we have, she also serves on the Board of Directors of the Institute for Nonprofit News. And then we have Pete Quist, who is a Research Director at the National Institute on Money and Politics. And before that, he was at Project Vote Smart, where he tracked the progress of congressional and state legislation. So we are going to have Sheila talk first, and then Pete, and then we will have time for questions. It's 10:30 right now, 10:30 for us, 8:30 for Pete. He's in Montana, and we go until 11:30. So Sheila and Pete, thank you very much and welcome, and I'll turn it over to Sheila.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Rather than diving into the tools on Open Secrets, I'm going to just go over some of the key trends in campaign finance. 2020 was an extraordinary cycle for so many reasons, a number of which I'm sure you're well aware of. So I'm going to go over some of the reasons from a campaign finance perspective. First of all, just quickly, CRP is a nonpartisan nonprofit research group that tracks money and politics. We are we're founded 38 years ago by two senators, Frank Church, a Democrat of Idaho, and Hugh Scott, a Republican of Pennsylvania. And we are not a campaign finance reform organization. We take, for instance, no position on Citizens United other than transparency. We do advocate for transparency. We feel we can't do our job, the press can't do its job, and the public can't do their job ultimately if we don't have access to the information. In 2020, we had crazy traffic. We had 10 million users, a record for us, and that actually continued into January, which was also an intense month. We had more than 1,000 custom data requests, largely many from journalists, also academics, and we had about 32,000 media citations. So a big year for money and politics and huge interest among the public. So in 2020, as I say, we saw a lot of changes, some spurred by the pandemic, many others by the intense reaction to pro and con to President Trump. Perhaps the most jaw-dropping was the off-the-charts fundraising and spending, which completely, as you can see, obliterated records. Looking at the data by type of race, most of the money, about 8.7 billion of that 14.4 billion was spent by congressional candidates, so 60%, and about 40%, 5.7 billion spent by presidential candidates. Of course, the Democrats had a wide open primary, lots of money spent there. And when we look at it by party, Democrats held the clear advantage. 58% was spent by Democrats compared to 37% by Republicans. But the candidates weren't the only ones spending big. Super PACs and other outside groups spent $2.9 billion in 2020, up from just $1.4 billion in the prior presidential cycle in 2016, and just over $300,000 back in 2010, right after the Citizens United decision. In many cases, these nominally independent outside groups acted more like extensions of the campaign themselves. There were 325 single candidate super PACs. So they only advocated for or against a single candidate. And they raised over million. They spent over 646 million. And in races, in 34 races, outside groups spent more than all of the candidates combined, up from 28 races in 2018 and just 26 races in 2016. So the outside spending was bigger, and it was targeted on the most competitive races, of which there were many. And that packs a punch and makes it an even taller order for the candidates themselves to keep up. Short of Congress passing the For the People Act or some other measure, I don't think it's coming from the courts at this moment, dark money does not appear to be going away, except, in fact, if anything, it's going up. A major source of that money was from opaque sources, the $666 million in the top left, from political nonprofits and shell companies that was going to super PACs and other outside groups. So that is one trend this cycle, more dark money, but more gray money, whereby super PACs are disclosing the funds, but we're still in the dark about the original source of where the money came from. Another change is that liberal groups directed more than $514 million in dark money in 2020, overshadowing about around 200 million that boosted Republicans. So that's a 180-degree reversal from the early days following Citizens United, when the vast majority of dark money was being raised and spent by Republican-leaning or conservative organizations. 170 million was spent on TV advertising. That's tracked by our partners at the Wesleyan Media Center. And just 88 million for FEC reported spending. So if you're relying on what's disclosed there, you're missing the story. And 132 million spent on digital ads. We're also partnering with NYU's Ad Observer to try to provide our numbers on spending to those organizations that have access to the content, are measuring kind of the negativity of the ads, how much is going on broadcast versus online, et cetera. And speaking of digital ads, when COVID came, the move from in-person fundraisers and door-to-door canvassers to online everything, including fundraising and organizing, happened. And for many candidates, it led to an abandonment of the ground game. We launched our online ads portal in September. It is updated weekly. It was updated weekly through the election. It's on pause now as we begin a new cycle. For your information going forward, if you have questions or want commentary on online digital ads, contact our research director, Sarah Briner, and researcher Anna Masolia, who have largely put together this portal. And it allows you to see data from Facebook and Google side by side, organized by group and searchable by advertising sponsor and candidate. We classify all of the Facebook pages into unique profiles. So for instance, Donald Trump had 18 distinct Facebook pages. So we pull that all together for the candidate. And it's really important to do that because so many of the committee names are misleading or complicated. We've gone through with more than 100,000 page name sponsor combinations in the Facebook data. We are also further identifying groups that are otherwise not in Open Secrets data, with a particular focus moving forward on state candidates and ballot measure committees, and matching that up with the Institute's data, with Pete's data. So where did all that money come from? A surprisingly large portion, and a huge theme for the 2020 elections, of course, was small donors, which overall made up more than 22% of the donations in 2020, up from 14% in 2016. It remains to be seen whether the intense interest from small dollar donors will be maintained without Trump on the ballot, but early indications from the first quarter appear that it may well. That small donor surge took a bite out of the PAC portion, which dropped from 9% in 2016 to just 5% in 2020. And business PACs, long the mainstay of PAC spending, have dropped as a percent of PAC spending. So even as the overall spending by biz PACs remains high, their proportion dropped from 72% to less than 60% in 2020. So business PACs are making up a smaller share, and they have kind of smaller buying power.
I'm sorry, just real quickly. Sorry if you said this, but small donations, what's the threshold for that? Is that the $200?
$200. But Act Blue is, of course, well, Act Blue and WinRed are reporting every single dollar. So we are deluged with data now, which is great. It's a lot more data to manage and store. So we are seeing every one of those donations and matching those donors to themselves, so we can see how often they're giving, the repeat donors, the new donors who haven't shown up in our databases before. It's a treasure trove of data, but it's largely for donors that are giving small amounts, very often on repeat. And there was a big story / scandal about how the Trump campaign had kind of put those donations on auto renewal with a lot of complaints resulting. Anyway, so $200 is the threshold, but we're getting more and more of kind of all of the donations from, as I say, from Act Blue and increasingly WinRed. So far this year, small donors delivered for Senate candidates like Sanders, as you can see, top of the chart. Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman and Ted Cruz round out the top three. Josh Hawley, down below in the middle ranks, was received a lot of attention recently, as did Marjorie Taylor Greene. She broke records for the total raised in the first quarter of an off election year with $3.2 million, which is astonishing. 80% of that came from small donors, though ProPublica recently revealed that this is in part the result of spending big on a GOP list rental. So they take a huge cut. So that mammoth haul comes perhaps with an asterisk. And the extreme nature of some of the candidates that small donors most favor has led to concern about the perpetual outrage machine and a debate about whether this is such a good thing after all. Donald Trump was the most successful candidate raising funds in small donations. Of course, some of the top recipients may just be good, adept at social media and go viral because they have skillful digital messaging more than bombast. So I think there is a mix there. And there's also a lot of interesting research coming out from the Campaign Finance Institute, from the Brennan Center, among others, that counters the notion that this is just fundraising. They're showing how small donor matching programs can have a big and positive impact on increasing representation. But this is an ongoing debate with kind of Rick Pildes, professor from NYU, leading the charge, saying that this is perhaps not such a healthy thing after all. But in the end, tons of money, so what? Well, importantly, all of that money translates into higher fundraising targets for candidates and more time away from legislating for members. In the House, winning candidates had to clear $2.4 million in 2020, up from $2 million in 2018, and way up from $1.5 million in 2016. And in the Senate, huge numbers of small donors backed a number of what turned out to be long shot candidates, McGrath in Kentucky, Harrison in South Carolina, Gideon, Greenfield, Cunningham, Bullock, all Democrats who all outspent the eventual victor. So was that money wasted, or was it like John Ossoff, where this is the losing campaign, but that sets them up for victory on down the line? So that remains to be seen. But a lot of money that many felt was money misspent. And it's been noted that small donors are made up of a higher percent of women, but as this chart shows, increasingly women are catching up as a percent of the large dollar donors as well. And related to this, we saw more diverse candidates running in 2020 in both parties, and more Republican women elected than in prior cycles. So big changes on kind of the race and gender front. Stay tuned for a report in the next week or two, I hope in the next week, with new data on that, data and analyses on candidate race and gender in 2020, with particular emphasis kind of picking apart the role that primaries, diversity in primaries plays versus the general. So more coming up on that shortly. And finally, on the lobbying front, it may be too early to tell where this trend line is headed. On the one hand, after companies spent $3.53 billion in 2020, the highest total spend on lobbying since 2011, the $886 million shown here spent in the Biden administration's first quarter is the lowest amount for a first quarter since 2017. So is it heading back down? I don't know. On the other hand, Biden's American Rescue Plan is the second most lobbied bill ever after the 2009 bailout bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And the number of clients lobbying on infrastructure jumped 23% compared with the first quarter in prior years. So there appears to be some good news for K Street, but it remains to be seen how they'll fare under Biden. For reporters, if you want to reach out to us, you can hit us up at press@crp.org, or you can reach out to me at skrumholz@crp.org, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
I guess before we go to Pete, is there any quick question for Sheila before we transition over to Pete? Orion?
Could I just quickly, sorry, Sheila, could you go back to that pie chart showing sources of breaking down funding from different sources?
Yeah, let me go back.
I just wanted to understand how, like, when we talk about dark money, where that fits in and what, there we go, thanks. At PACs, we see about 5%, but what of this would you call dark money?
Well, it's not broken out here. It would include both organizations, money coming directly from the corporate treasury or labor union treasury, to the degree there's that, or trade associations, and then also individuals, folks like Sheldon Adelson, Tom Steyer. So that would be in this mix, but is not represented in this chart. You can see that probably most easily on our outside spending section, where you can look for you can break it out by disclosure. So you can see the amount of money that was just fully disclosed, partially disclosed, or not disclosed at all. And you'll see there that it's morphed from the dark money being not disclosed at all to a hybrid, to this gray money that is disclosed by super PACs, but the original source is still coming from, say, a politically active, non-disclosing nonprofit.
Okay, thank you.
Sheila, if you could keep it up there and go back to the bar chart by year about the total spending.
Oh yeah, the first one.
Yeah. So I guess so. The 14.4 billion. So this is congressional and presidential. So this includes like Michael Bloomberg's $1 billion.
Yes.
I mean, do we have a sense of this 14.4 billion? Outside of Bloomberg, Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, how much of this was coming from those super big money vanity projects?
Well, the candidate, the billionaire presidential candidates, Bloomberg and Steyer, and then we have the 2.9 billion in outside spending, which is in large part coming from billionaires like Sheldon Adelson and Tom Steyer.
Yeah.
Several $1 billion coming from those kind of unlimited sources. But on the other hand, as you can see here, well, I guess you can't see it here because we've included both of that. For instance, the $8.7 billion spent on congressional races. That includes both the monies raised in limited amounts by the candidates as well as the outside groups targeting those races. So we can get that for you, and it's been in our press releases, or rather our reports wrapping up the cycle, but I don't have that breakdown here.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. I was just kind of curious. All right, so let's transition over to Pete. So welcome, Pete.
Hi, guys. So I'm the research director at the National Institute on Money and Politics, and most of you, I think, are pretty familiar with us. This is our homepage at followthemoney.org. We also have a division of our organization called the Campaign Finance Institute at another website, cfinst.org, that I'll highlight very briefly as well. But our focus has primarily been on state campaigns, and so that's what I'm going to focus on here. And at the state level, elections are happening all the time. Right now, this year, we have standard elections happening in Virginia and New Jersey, as a couple of states that just hold their elections in odd-numbered years for state government office. And there are other states that do that as well that aren't doing it this year, but will be in 2023 and in that 4-year cycle. And then coming up in 2022, that is the even-numbered year, that is the big year in state elections. So the non-presidential election years feature a lot of gubernatorial contests, 36 of them actually, barring any special elections. And this year we will probably be having a recall election around November in California for their gubernatorial seat as well. So a lot going on. We've been collecting state level campaign finance data from all 50 states for about 20 years. And so we've got a lot of historical data to sort of contextualize what's happening and are happy to answer questions as you're working on state campaign finance and political reporting. What I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about some of the trends at the state level. They overlap a little bit with some of the federal, but they also have some differences. And then highlight a couple of tools that can help make sense of it all, and also tie in campaign finance to governance. This website has the ability to run a lot of different queries. Right now, I have run a preloaded query here of contributions to candidates for state government office. And what we have here is a table listing the dollar amounts by year. And so you can have a look at how much money is raised by candidates as they're running for these offices. Again, 2018, 2022, those are the big cycles in state government races. And so we see those kind of up at the top here. 2020 and 2016 are comparable cycles as is 2012. So what we found is that 2020, even adjusted for inflation, is pretty normal, although a little bit on the higher end for what we've seen in state campaigns recently. It was actually on pace to exceed the 2016 total late last year, but I think potentially with lack of local fundraisers and candidates going door to door with COVID, we didn't see the late spike that we normally see right before the general election, at least to the same extent. That said, the number of transactions is actually pretty high. So what we're seeing here, what this is indicating is that there are more small donors getting engaged at least earlier in the process, even though we didn't see such a late spike. And so we are seeing an increase in small donors at the state level as well, although it isn't having quite the same impact that we see at the federal level with the spike in dollar amounts. Notably, 2018 had a very high number as well. So potentially we'll see the same thing coming into 2022. The trends that I'm showing you here are national. So this is all state government offices across the country. It's possible to do this kind of a query in any given state too. So don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to say that a few times during this presentation. Our phone number is on the bottom of any page on our website. And if you give us a call, I'll actually pick up the phone. We did a joint report with the Center for Responsive Politics late last year. And it took a look at a couple of the large trends here. I want to mention that the small donors piece is a key piece that's been happening at the federal level, especially, and to some extent at the state level. And potentially we'll see even more of that at the state level as WinRed gets bigger and we start potentially seeing more of an arms race between the two. It'll be really interesting to see what happens there. But on this, we're also seeing an increase in out-of-state donors. And it's very much benefiting the Democrats, at least in 2020. And so this is a chart showing the out-of-state donors to candidates at the state level by political party affiliation. As you can see, 2012 actually saw quite a bit more. This is defined as donors under $200, so we're using the federal definition. Where you draw the line in state campaign finance matters, though. So these charts, this should be more of a guideline than really a hard piece. In many states, $200 is not that small of a donation. It actually exceeds the contribution limit for a state house candidate in Montana. But in many states, it is a pretty good measure. Another trend that's happening is that we're seeing more women getting involved as candidates and as donors. And this is looking at contributions from women donors to state level candidates by party affiliation. We're seeing Democrats benefiting the most here, but this is something where we're seeing a higher percentage of contributions in general coming from women. And we're also seeing a higher number of candidates who are women running for office at the state level, which we've been able to determine from a joint project between the Institute and the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University, who identify and track women candidates for state office. In fact, in 2020, about 44% of Democratic candidates were women, and about 23% of Republican candidates were women. But both numbers, despite the disparity there, are trending upward. Another piece that's worth keeping an eye out on for campaign finance trends at the state level going forward are small donor matching programs. We have one that is starting in New York State. And it's modeled a little bit after the program in New York City. This is an idea where they're trying to increase the engagement of small donors, which right now feels a little bit hairy because we're seeing small donors really migrating toward extreme candidates on the left and the right. But some of these programs are really designed to try to bring out the donors that aren't that engaged. So for example, with a program like that, you may be looking at candidates getting they'd be getting a public match of money for contributions that they receive from a donor who gives under a certain dollar threshold. And usually, or potentially, you can draw that regulation to only apply to donors within your district. So for example, in New York City, if you're running for city council there, you get a match for contributions that you get from small donors in your district. And so what they're trying to do with those programs is change the behavior of the candidate to rely more on average people in their districts. There are some programs in various localities around the country that are trying something similar, including Los Angeles, a couple of counties in Maryland, and a few others. And I think that we will see some more efforts at the state level very shortly. Another trend at the state level is that elections tend not to be particularly financially competitive. What we're talking about here is the idea that two candidates can raise competing amounts of money. And the definition that I'm using when I initially say that is that if you've got two candidates running for a single seat and one of them is raising more than twice as much money as the other one, then that's not a competitive race financially. If the lower fundraiser is raising more than half as much as the leading fundraiser, then we'll go ahead and call that financially competitive. And that's a pretty generous definition. We have a tool on our website called the Competitiveness Index, which you can get to using this menu option and then going to Tools and then going to Competitiveness Index. And this highlights what's happening here. And so right now what this is looking at are all races for around the country. I'm going to just change this to state level races. And it's looking at the races in 2020. And it's looking at whether or not they're financially competitive by that definition that I used with the 2-to-1 ratio. And what we're seeing is that about 21% of the races for state government in this country were financially competitive with that very generous definition in 2020. 1,200 races, 1,300 races or so. Some of them, almost a quarter, or over a fifth at least, were not even contested, which meant that the voters didn't have a choice at all. Races tend to be a little more competitive if contribution limits are quite low, or if there are public funding programs. This is a chart that we put together just kind of internally here, so you're getting a sneak preview here of what contribution limits are in states for state house races and how financially competitive the races tended to be over time. And so our x-axis there is the election year, and then the y-axis is the percent of the races that were financially competitive given that 2-to-1 threshold. Obviously, all of these are still pretty low, but the blue bar is higher than the rest, and this is representing states where contribution limits are $1,000 or less for a state house candidate over a 2-year period. And then the next lowest contribution limit was 1,001 to 2,500 under this classification, and that sort of drifts back down into the pack. And so we see that only the very lowest contribution limits here seem to have an impact. For state Senate offices, it's not quite as clear as that. We have the same contribution limit breakdowns. The very lowest contribution limits, again, tend to rise up. We also see a little bit of coming out of the grouping by the next lowest tier, indicating that perhaps because state Senate races are a little bit more expensive just generally, that perhaps a slightly higher contribution limit could still create more competitive races. These contribution limit classifications come from a great tool from our Campaign Finance Institute division, which is found at cfinst.org. They became part of the Institute a few years ago. On their website, if you click on this groundbreaking database of state laws, this is a legend with the same contribution limits that we were just looking at. So in the states, every state gets to set up its entire, essentially, campaign finance regime with very few restrictions from outside of its jurisdiction. So some states don't have contribution limits at all, notably Texas and Pennsylvania. And then other states have limits of various size. In Montana, we're looking at 360, and you can change this out to candidates for Senate or governor and so forth. And this can help give you some context about the size of the contributions that you're seeing in the states. And it also allows us to tie those laws into what's actually happening and be able to see how they impact campaign finance practices. Public funding states also tend to be a little bit more financially competitive. Maine is a public funding state. We're seeing them at about 37% competitive, as opposed to the 21 or 22% that we saw nationally. Arizona and Connecticut are 2 more as well. This shading actually represents financial competitiveness being higher. Virginia and New Jersey are very well shaded just because they had only a couple of special elections in 2020. And those do tend to be more competitive. This tool allows you to actually get into a state, and I'm going to highlight that a little bit because redistricting is happening. And as you're writing about redistricting stories, if you're looking at, say, Wisconsin, you can come in here and actually take a look at which races were financially competitive, which seats seem to be safe, which seats seem to be perhaps less safe. We can limit this just to state legislative seats. And then in this way, you can start looking at where lines are getting drawn, which of course is a big story over the next couple of years here. This is one of the reasons that we actually put this tool together, is for folks to take a look at the impacts of redistricting, whether financial competitiveness or vote competitiveness, which you can also measure here, are impacted by redistricting.
Pete, just a quick question on definitions. I think you said this, but I missed it. What's the definition of competitive?
Yeah, so under the financial competitiveness, and this tool actually allows you to create your own definition, but what it's defaulting to is a 2-to-1 ratio for candidates where the top fundraising candidate, let's say you've got 2 candidates in a race for a single district. The math gets a little more complicated when you're talking about multi-seat districts, but for a single seat district, if you've got 2 candidates running, and one candidate raises more than twice as much as the other, then we're going to call that uncompetitive. This district is, the color coding on this is that green represents financially competitive districts, red represents financially uncompetitive districts, and gray represents uncontested districts where there just weren't candidates to choose from. On the screen, you can see that Ron Tussler did not raise more than twice as much as Emily Voigt, and so we're calling this a financially competitive race. So it's a really generous definition. And then on the vote threshold, what we're using is a 10-point vote margin. And so this race here will be uncompetitive by votes for Joel Kitchen and Kim Jensen, because Kitchen's won by more than 10% of the vote, a 55 to 45 split. This tool has a lot of options on it. I want folks to feel comfortable reaching out. If you're interested in looking at redistricting or financial competitiveness generally, or anything like that, give us a call and I can help you with this tool. I've just got a couple minutes left here, so I want to highlight a tool that can help get into the governance piece. And this is our power mapping tool. And here I've pulled up New York. And what this graph is showing us is an x-axis of how likely a elected official, so these are all elected officials here, are going to support or oppose a piece of legislation or an issue. And the y-axis is how much decision-making power they have based on their position. So at the top, this is all Assembly and Senate and gubernatorial office holders. At the top of any of these lists is going to be the governor with the power to sign or veto legislation. And then the other dots are representing state legislators who are given power based on being Senate president or House speaker or chairing a lot of legislative committees and so forth. But you can take, if you've got an industry that is supporting a piece of legislation or opposing it, you can map out how likely elected officials are to support or oppose that legislation or that issue based on their campaign finance data. And you can do that even for legislative committees. I'm going to limit this to a specific legislative committee to make this chart a little easier to see. So I'm doing the New York House Real Property Taxation Committee. And now we've just got a few dots here representing members of this legislative committee. And let's say we've got an issue before the legislature that is in this committee that is impacting maybe real estate development and union contracts for building or something. And so perhaps this is our industry classification scheme. Most of you are familiar with this, I believe, and it very much represents that of the Center for Responsive Politics. Under finance, insurance, and real estate, I can select real estate as being very supportive of the issue before the legislature. And perhaps I can get into labor and say the general trade unions and maybe even the transportation unions are opposing this issue. And then what this is doing is mapping out these legislative committee members on their x-axis, likely to support or likely to oppose the issue before the committee based on their campaign finance data. We initially created this tool to help advocates kind of decide if the people that they were counting on might need a little shoring up, or if they might be able to flip somebody over to their side of an issue by being close to the center here. But reporters have found it kind of interesting to look at people who are very much on the edges and why they aren't getting contributions from one of the industries or getting overwhelming contributions from the other. And you can actually click on a person and get into the money behind this as well. So this is our one of our efforts to try to tie campaign finance into governance and actual government outcomes. So we have others, and I'd love to go over other tools with folks if they're interested in setting up a call. We can certainly do that.
Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions. We'll go first to Nathaniel.
Hey there, thanks so much for doing this. Sorry if I missed it, but is this only for state houses and state senate, or is this also, can this also be done congressionally for the Senate and the House?
That power mapping is available for Congress as well, although we are still updating our 2021 legislative committee memberships, so it isn't fully functional yet, but it will be very soon.
Okay, Nathaniel's from Newsy. So when you putting a question in, I tell them where you're from. Arjun?
Hey, I'm Arjun. I'm from the Washington Post. I was wondering, could you elaborate a little bit on like how you come up with the criteria for the power mapping in terms of like, does it incorporate clout at all in there? And how do you sort of gauge whether a member is going to be less supportive or more supportive? Sort of like, how do you meld that with this more backroom politicking aspect of politics?
Yeah, absolutely. The clout question is an interesting one. We have done some experimenting with trying to measure how effective some donors are at their lobbying. There used to be an organization called Digital Democracy in California that did this great project of videoing all of the legislative committee testimonies and then also putting them into word searchable. So you could jump to points in the video where people said something and documenting who was supporting and opposing each piece of legislation. And then documenting what happened to that legislation. So it made it very easy to see who tended to be very successful on lobbying. And we did marry that to some of our campaign finance data and do some analysis of what that would look like. It's very much a pilot project, and that group no longer exists. And so we haven't been able to expand it really. So what it's doing on that tool right now is simply looking at treating everyone the same. But the dollar amounts are the measure of impact. Obviously, there are a lot of other things that also play into how a legislator votes on a piece of legislation. Campaign finance is what we have to add, so that's all that we consider on it. But as advocacy organizations or journalists are familiar with other relationships that might exist, advocacy organizations in general tend to create power maps that have a lot of different information in them, and this is something that they can plug in as another input on that.
Other questions, folks? So I have a question for both of you. Both of you talked about the switch in where money was coming from, whether it was Republican or conservative or liberal, Republican or Democratic, and that Democrats, used to be at a disadvantage both in big money donors and in out-of-state donations, and then that's flipped over the last couple of cycles. Could you maybe talk about where the money is coming from? Is there a sense of whether that's just a handful of the big money donors who are sprinkling their money around, or is it a more broad-based changeover, and that Democrats have a much bigger and therefore broader base, and which would say it might be more enduring, whereas if it's just a few big billionaires, they might go away after a few cycles?
Very broadly at the state level, incumbents are still significantly outraising anybody who's challenging them for office. And they're doing it in the traditional way of receiving contributions from PACs, or in the states that permit it, from corporations and unions directly, which is about half of the states. And they're raising that money early, and they win around 93 to 95% of the time, regardless of who they're facing at election. For state legislative offices, gubernatorials can become a little bit trickier. And we've seen an increase actually in sort of the Michael Bloomberg approach of self-financing. Actually, maybe we could call it the Meg Whitman approach. So that tends not to work very well. Self-financing candidates tend not to do very well at the ballot box, and the more they self-finance their campaign as a percentage of their fundraising, the worse they do. There are some notable exceptions, however, such as J.B. Pritzker, although he faced another self-financer. So.
Okay. Sheila, do you have a sense?
Yeah, I was just going to say on the federal side, the maturation of Act Blue as the go-to fundraising platform for all Democratic candidates and party committees is, an overwhelming strength for them. I think it can't. It's not just the Bloombergs and the Steyers up at the top. It's the massive numbers of donors, many of them brought into the system for the first time in 2020, perhaps again largely as in response to the Trump presidential campaign, and so it remains to be seen whether those donors will stick around for campaigns to come. But the adoption, the wholesale adoption of Act Blue as the platform is an enormous benefit to them. But WinRed is catching up, and so it'll be interesting to see the degree to which WinRed is also kind of wholesale adopted by all Republican committees, and whether, again, there is the kind of intensity of massive numbers of donors giving amounts at all levels without a Trump on the ballot.
I'm sorry, go on, Pete.
I just want to elaborate on that at the state level. One of the things that we don't know yet that could certainly happen very quickly is the trickling down of those donors to state campaigns. As donors become more sophisticated, they will start to give to races that matter at lower levels, potentially, at lower levels of government. So starting to get into state legislative or gubernatorial campaigns, particularly if there are pushes to get out of state donors to give to races that might flip a chamber and that sort of thing.
And on the WinRed Act Blue dynamic, Sheila, you said that every one of those contributions is disclosed, even if it's $1 or $5 or whatever. Why did they start doing that? Were they mandated to do so? And why are they disclosing those when before something under $200 wouldn't have been?
That's a good question. I had always understood that they were not required to, but I could be wrong. So somebody here may actually know the answer to that definitively. I think it's easy for them to just disclose everything, and it's they're crowing about their immense success with accumulation of numbers of donors, not just the massive haul that they delivered. For us, over the years, there's been a call by some of the advocates saying, "Oh, who cares about the $200 donors? In fact, we should lift the limit for disclosure to $500 or $1,000." Like, does anybody really think $200 is having undue influence or presenting conflicts of interest? From our perspective, it's a double-edged sword. We now have this massive number of donations that we have to process each download. Storage is more expensive, and so it's just a bigger process, because we do go through all the donations to classify them by industry and standardize them by organization. They provide information that's useful. So a $1,000 donation might have best efforts in the occupation line, but the $10 donation says bank CEO. So it's all useful information. It's just at what cost. And Act Blue, and I'm sure WinRed too, again, they're crowing about their success. So they're providing a lot of analytics on exactly what their donors look like, and how it's grown over a short period of time.
Okay. Orion.
Thanks. I'm with the Spokesman Review in Spokane, Washington, so I cover Washington and Idaho. And Pete, I just wanted to make sure I understood the Idaho state profile from the main Follow the Money page. Clicking on Idaho, I see an A for independent spending and an F for the contributions rank. I just want to understand how we got that F. Could you explain that to me?
Yeah, in Idaho, that's related to a lack of employment disclosure for campaign finance donors, for campaign donors, which makes it very difficult to classify industry analysis. For example, it makes it harder for us to determine which donors are the same donors and so forth. Also, Idaho has made some improvements since we published that score. It did have a lot of paper campaign finance filings, and it has moved toward electronic filing. We actually do deal with handwritten paper reports in some of the states, which is a challenge, but we get them all anyway, so we are 100% comprehensive. But Idaho has made some strides there. They would get a better score if we update that.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Pete, who is still on paper?
So there are some filings in California, actually, that are on paper that are important to know about. They are small committees. It's actually pretty easy to hit the threshold where you have to file electronically, but the state doesn't really make it known that there are paper filers. We actually get those sent to us in the mail. There are paper filings in some other states. Notably, Pennsylvania has pretty much all paper filing. The state agency keys in that data but they don't make the paper filings publicly available. And so we actually experienced some pretty lengthy delays in Pennsylvania waiting for the agency to key that data in for us. So there's just a lot of variation around the country. States are increasingly moving to electronic filing, mandatory electronic filing even. The states that were sort of balking at it for being too rural to require people to electronically file have sort of been losing that argument since Wyoming and Alaska both went all electronic. And that's actually been helpful for some of the states that have been making that argument and are starting to move electronically now.
So the few places that are still sending in paper these coming on horseback or regular postal service or?
Fortunately, California is the only place where we get anything actually sent to us in the mail anymore. Thank you, Kentucky, for finishing up your electronic filing requirement. But it's only one box now as opposed to the many boxes that there used to be when I started working here.
All right. Caroline Simon.
Hey, thank you so much for talking to us. I wanted to ask about how the pandemic has changed the way that fundraising works. I know a lot of the big fundraising dinners had to be held over Zoom. So just kind of like how that has affected how candidates fundraise and whether any of those changes will stick around once things go back to normal.
That's a great question. At the national level, of course, we saw, how that played out with the various campaigns. The Trump campaign continuing to hold rallies well into the pandemic, and Biden and others choosing not to. But I think there has to be a huge benefit to holding these events online. If they can figure out the magic sauce to be successful, that's such a more efficient way to kind of husband resources, keep the money, and not have to put out huge outlays for in-person events. But it also comes at the cost of those kind of boots on the ground organizing and that more useful face-to-face contact. So I would think there would be a hybrid, but I expect that as soon as we can get back to it, we'll be back to boxes at stadiums and the kind of breakfast, lunches, receptions, dinners that we historically have seen. Pete, what about at the state level?
At the state level, I think that it's hard for us to see exactly when that's happening. Most states don't classify event contributions, but it seems like we saw less of that since we didn't see the late spike that we normally see with campaign contributions to the same extent. Normally, a huge percentage, around 40% or so of the contributions that candidates raise in general at the state level come in the last 2 months of the campaign. And that did not materialize to nearly the same extent this year. So I think that there was less of that happening. I personally suspect that there are a lot of opportunities for private conversations at those kinds of events. And so we should see some resumption, I would expect, at least for gubernatorial campaigns. At the state level, campaigns vary quite a bit in the way that they're run. In Montana, if you're running for state legislature, you better be knocking on doors personally if you're going to win, as opposed to New York, where you might have a television market you can appeal to, so which doesn't exist in most of the state here. So.
Thanks. I also forgot to say I'm with CQ Roll Call, but thank you for answering.
All right. Any other questions? I have one final one if nobody else raises their hand. This is both for Sheila and for Pete. What's the one tool or thing that you guys have built on your websites that you think is really cool that you wish more journalists would realize is cool and execute some stories with it? I mean, what do you? Everybody kind of knows about the straight campaign contributions. What else have you built that you hope reporters start to use?
Pete's got all the cool tools, so I'm going to go first with just a couple of quick things on the CRP website, on the Open Secrets website. First of all, the election overview is where you can get all of those statistics going back in time, so you can see kind of what the trend line is on any particular campaign finance topic. But we also have a feature called featured data sets. So when we start getting a bunch of questions from reporters like following the corporate stands, stands by corporations after the January 6th insurrection, and then continuing rollout of bans on donations after the Georgia pullback on voting access. We have, like, for 3 months, we've been getting calls from reporters saying, what is the reliance on PACs? Like, how big a deal is this? And so we put that together, and that will be going up there shortly. I think they wanted to include Q1 for 2021 in that before they post it. But that's where we will say, you know, this is the 5th call today on this. We're just going to throw that data up there so that it's accessible to all, so that we don't have to keep sending it out to people. So featured data sets is one place to kind of keep an eye on.
Okay. And Pete, cool tools?
Yeah, for us, the PAR mapping is certainly one, and the Competitiveness Index is one that kind of rises up every 10 years or so. We also have some tools that we haven't made really pretty yet, but are out there, where you can measure, you can look at a candidate and see other candidates that look the most similar in their fundraising profile. Are they getting similar dollar amounts from similar donors, to look for those kinds of networks that are happening in the background? And similarly, looking at donors who have other donors with a similar profile. And so you can actually pull up people or groups and see kind of what those networks look like. And this is part of dreams of having, like, node diagrams of networks that are happening in the background of campaign finance. We have the ability to look at industry breakdowns by legislative committees in a lot of different ways. The power mapping is just one, but you can actually do contributions to committees in data sets that you can really dig into. And you can do contributions just to sitting elected office holders in every state as a group, and start seeing who's the biggest donor to everybody making decisions in state campaigns or state government. And then I'll very briefly sort of highlight this one piece that is our API feed, which allows you to do things. This is a group called WRAL. It's a public radio station in North Carolina that publishes a lot of online articles. This is an article from a few years ago where they're announcing this stream of our API data. And if they write about somebody who's in office and you mouse over their name, you get their top campaign finance donors. And these API streams are being used in a lot of cool ways like that, that I would love to see even more of.
Okay. All right. Very good information, very cool tools. So Sheila and Pete, I want to thank you both for stopping by and talking with our fellows. Both organizations are incredibly responsive and helpful for journalists. So if you haven't dealt with them on a one-on-one basis yet, realize that you can, and reach out to them and to get bounce ideas off, or to get help looking at their information, or to get help with analysis of data. So Sheila and Pete, thanks for stopping by, and thanks for both of your organizations for all you do to help journalists.
You guys are why we do what we do. So please do reach out. It's what we're here for.
Exactly. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, everybody.
All right.
Let us know if you need anything.